Hi guys, this month we're going to talk about debates in culture. Now this is one of my most favorite of all time areas of debating because it's something that's really subjective, right? Cultures. There's always some part of it which you can debate. And it's also really rich because it's all around us. Culture means art, means language, means movies. And it's something that is persuading you and impacting you, even though you don't really know that it has. So we're going to talk about that. In the first week, we're going to talk about the debates about preservation versus evolution of culture. And this is the most common area of debating, or one of the most common areas. And the topic we're going to look at is requiring students to learn cultural arts or performances. So let's get right to it. So this debate, primarily about culture, obviously. But the big distinction is whether or not you should preserve or you should let it evolve, right? To let it change. And this is a really interesting aspect with the debate. Because culture is something that we all kind of feel is important, yet it's intangible. It's not like food. It's not like, air. It's not a human right. Or is it a human right? And this is where there's rich area to debate, because the first thing that you need to talk about here is the value of culture. How valuable culture is. Everyone feels a kind of intangible importance. If I were to say that you don't have a culture, you'd be a little bit kind of insulted. You say, no, of course I have culture, right? Because culture sort of denotes, implies that you have history, you have tradition, you have something that makes you unique and distinct. And that's what makes culture valuable. Groups of people share a kind of similarity, and that similarity can be a similarity of food, of language, of many of these other different things. And that gives you a sense of belonging, that you belong to this group, right? Like you belong to a team. That's why teams have team names, and team sometimes has a team song, and teams wear team clothes and uniforms, because that sense of uniformity gives you a sense of belonging, and that sense of belonging gives you a sense of strength. So if you think about, ancient old times, because a group could belong together, and that group became stronger because their culture bonded them. They shared a similar language, a similar food, they wore similar clothes. So maybe when they went to war, even though that other person, I don't really know his name, but I know that he and I share the same culture, that we belong to the same group. And therefore that bonds us together. That makes me fight for you, that makes you fight for me, so on and so forth. But that's the intangible value of culture. And that's a big part of this debate. And this will be debated and the debate is to what extent this is important, right? Is it important enough to preserve because it's so important that it still impacts us today, or should we let it evolve? Because this is the other interesting thing about culture. Culture is not fixed. Language is not fixed. It keeps changing. The Korean language is very distinct, but across even the last 10 years, it has adapted many other words into its language. The form of speaking, has changed, as happens with many other languages. So, should you let these cultures instead evolve? Who determines what is important, not important? And because it's hard to draw a line, maybe we should let society. That's the most democratic, open, position of that a state can take, right? So that's a big part of this debate, and inherently a huge part of debates about culture. And in fact, any kind of debate about culture is your position on culture. How important is culture, right? So that's the first one. How important is culture? And to what extent do we need to preserve culture? To what extent do we need to let that culture evolve? So you need to define culture. You need to give that culture some kind of value, right? So how is it valuable? So you talk about the notion of identity to individuals, why that identity is important. You talk about a sense of belonging, right? How it creates a sense of belonging, and why that helps people feel less insecure about who they are. Now, this applies in societies where you have different cultures interacting with each other, and we'll get to some of those things later, but also to societies where you have just one kind of culture. right? So like in Korean or in Japanese societies and so on and so forth. And because on the other side, even if you have a dominant culture, that culture is changing, right? That culture is evolving because you have modern influences, right? You have new music, you have new ideas, new concepts, and you have youth. So youth always has a new take on culture. Well, not youth as just in young, but each next generation, right? Believe it or not, your parents had a different take on their parents' culture, as you do on your parents' culture, and as your children will on your culture. So it's a kind of evolution. Just like each next generation is slightly taller than the previous generation, if you live a healthy life, then each next generation will try to find a new way to adapt and to change culture. So should we let this happen? If it's a natural process, should we let this change? Because not letting this happen naturally means that you're creating a difference, right? You're doing something that could shake things up, and maybe that could lead to some harms. Okay, so excuse me. On the opposite side of this debate is to let things evolve, to concede that maybe culture is a little bit important to some extent, but that importance can be replaced with other things, with new forms of culture, and why that's better, right? So it's not enough for you to just say, not important, let it go, but why these things are much, much better. Okay, so this is the debate about culture in terms of preserving versus evolving culture, and we'll get into in detail by looking at one example. So the example I've chosen today is that this house will require students to learn cultural arts or performances. So this is a debate about culture. It's also a debate about the rights of students. So don't get carried away, right? When trying to understand what this debate is about, don't just make it a debate about students and whether students should be forced or parental rights and just involvement in school. Do schools have a right or not have a right? Then you lose all the cultural aspect of this debate. Of course, that is important. Whether or not you can force students to do something or not force them to do something is important. And it's also important to talk about why students, right? Why do we want young people to learn it? And that's something the government side needs to do to distinct their case from the opposition side. But don't get carried away and just have a debate about education. Okay? So that's the first thing that this debate is about students. You need to explain why students. Okay? And then why do they have to learn cultural arts and performances? We'll get into some pro arguments, but essentially you'll need to set up a situation where culture's morphing and changing and things are disappearing, and you need to take a position on culture. I'm not sure you need to have a model that much in this debate. You may want to give a few examples about different kinds of cultural arts and performances, right? So like some kind of dances and musical instruments, right? And then so if in plays, doing this allows you to talk about how these things are important, okay? Because you can talk about how plays are a depiction of how life used to be in the past, teach us a little bit about our ancestors and our values, as does musical instruments, because you learn about how those musical instruments were made and what they were used for, right? And all of those different things. And similarly with dances. So you need to create some kind of tangible thing around these cultural, items. I said you don't really need a model, and I still stick by that. But I think you don't run something that is too soft, right? If you're going to run a model, don't do something that has absolutely no value. So don't say that, for 5 minutes a week, students will watch a video about pansori, right? Or we'll have to read one book one semester about a cultural art or performance. That's what we mean by learn cultural arts and performances. That's quite lame, okay? Because quite honestly, because then it has no value. If I watch that video for 5 minutes, I'm not really doing anything. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to show that if I have a very small model, then, the other side can't say that I'm forcing people to do things. But if your model is really tiny, you're also not bringing any benefit. You're not bringing any impact. You're not bringing any change. Okay. The other side of the spectrum. So that's your spectrum. This is like too small impact. Nothing, right? 5 seconds a week. And over here, maybe too high. You say that they need to pass this class, they need to get an A before they graduate in cultural studies. They will spend 10 hours a day doing it. That also doesn't make sense. Okay. So you need something in the middle, in between, something that students maybe do a little bit now of, that's kind of maybe optional, but still important and has a high position, or is mandatory, like physical education, maybe, that is not directly related to the academic studies, but has a impact on their holistic development and social well-being and so on and so forth. Okay. So pick a nice line in the middle to draw it and do a correlation, compare with another activity that students do right now. So maybe PE, right? Physical education. Or if they have civic studies or something like that, say, with that kind of same standard, that's what we mean. That's how we're going to present this class. Okay. So that's what this debate is about. Let's get to the Gov approach. In the Gov case, so I talked a little bit about model and stuff, which is part of the Gov case. But these are mainly the arguments that I think you can run. Okay. So the first thing is to talk about the importance of arts, or the importance of, arts as a form of culture. Right. So the Gov side really has to show why culture is important. If at the end of the debates, people feel that culture is not so important, I don't really have a value from culture, then you will lose, right? Regardless of whether you have an amazing model and whether you make people laugh throughout the entire debate, if they feel that culture is not important, you lose. It's very simple. So you need to show that it is important. How can you show that it's important? Again, it's not something tangible. Okay, so don't try to show that it's tangible, but defend the importance of intangible things. Right? Show people why religion is important. It's intangible, but yet it's something that's guaranteed as like a kind of fundamental right. Your race and ethnicity is intangible, but it's important. Your identity, right, is something that is intangible, and everybody gets to define on their own, but it's super, super important. And there are lots of symbols that all creates the sense of intangible, but cohesive collective importance. The reason why countries have flags, right? Or why you sing songs. All of these things create a sense of togetherness, and that togetherness, that intangible togetherness is super, super important. Okay. So again, you don't need to show that this will change the world, and you can set the standard. You can say, I'm not going to show you that without culture, people will die, but I can show you that without culture, people will feel less whole. People will feel like they've lost something, right? So if you look at communities that through colonialism had their culture eradicated, like Native American or indigenous populations, they feel a sense of loss because they don't understand or can't trace their roots, or children who've been like transplanted, right, adopted, moved to another culture, they don't feel like they fit in, and they try to get their cultural root. The same can happen to societies that lose connections with their past, their culture, and feel like they've changed too much. Okay, so that has to be a huge point that you need to develop right at the start and carry through the case. You also then need to talk about why it's important then to sustain it. So it's kind of tied in, but show why it's important to sustain in the face of like new media, the modern society, in commercialized culture. Right? So don't just say, well, it's important because it's important, but it's important to sustain it because it's being challenged. So the culture has a value on its own, but it's also in an environment where you have like a market of other forces, right? Culture pushing. You have Hollywood promoting culture very strongly. You have the English language, you have the internet drowning out all these minority cultures, and it's just disappearing. So it's far more attractive for young kids to want to do a play about foreign culture, things that they have no real relationship with, to perform things they watch on television and in MTV, rather than to ask themselves about their own history, about the things that are around them, to try to understand their language and the roots of their language or their culture. They almost view it as something that is foreign to them, right? You put on this costume, you don't really know it, you understand it, and then you reject it and you go, these clothes, I like wearing this t-shirt, right? It feels much more comfortable, but not so much my culture. I'm not saying you need to wear, hanbok all the time, but you need to kind of appreciate it and understand where it comes from. And that gives you that sense of belonging. Okay. So talk about how the culture is being challenged, how these minority cultures cannot compete on its own because you have this mass produced global culture, Western culture, if you like, that is kind of challenging it and drowning it out, right? The many other influences, because that's how the world works nowadays. Making this point is also keeping in mind that what the other side is going to run, because they are probably going to say that the culture can survive on its own, right? So you're trying to show that it cannot survive on its own. Aha, very clever, very clever. Moving along, right? The next thing you need to talk about is how it impacts the students. And here I think you have some space to make some interesting points, to show how the culture creates, more confidence, how you can develop some soft skills in terms of in general for these students, right? Why it has a positive value, not just on their character, but also maybe on their cognitive aspects. Okay. So talk about, firstly, in regards to students, the two things. So one, the role of students, what they learn, what they study. Now, it's not true that it's all academic, right? So it's not all academic. And this is where when you talk about students learning music in school or physical education, right? So that's what schools try to do is develop this sense of holistic value. That's why schools also try to develop patriotism, try to develop a sense of community, right? So you can show how this is in line with the role of schools, to develop all the other things that schools are developing, okay? And in line with the role of students. And then show that there are some specific benefits to students. So other than developing their sense of identity, it can also develop their creativity, right? Develop their confidence. Okay, so you drew all this like bonus points. So not only now do you develop your culture, but you also get to become more confident, become more creative, and so on and so forth, right? Now, I forgot one thing. The end goal of this proposal is to create kind of, two benefits. One is to create a kind of awareness. So students, young people, you need to talk about why young people will have this awareness, and not awareness in the sense that I just watch something, but awareness in the sense that I do it, I understand it, I live it. So if I'm actually part of this performance, I can see it through the performer's eyes, through how people in the past used to see these things and how they play these instruments, right? So how they channel creativity through that. So I'm living through those eyes, right? And why that's important for young people. And it creates, so it's more than just awareness, it creates a sense of identification with it. And then you can also show how this in the long run sustains that culture in society, right? So what does it mean to sustain culture? It means not just, one performance a year. It means that it becomes a part of people's lives, just like sustaining a language. So it's not just that I speak this once a year, but I can speak it whenever I want to. I'm familiar with it. I have that language lying around my house, and sometimes I want to play it, right? So I understand the role that it plays in my life, okay? And that's going to be the end goal of this policy. So you can show how what students will do then eventually is they get more familiarized with this in the sense of a deeper sense of awareness. And some of them may go on to perform it and share it and use it to express their ideas and creativity just in normal life. So when you go out with your friends, you could play a cultural instrument. You help your kids later in life organize a cultural play. When you go out and watch these plays that other professionals do, you understand it much more at a much deeper level. So it creates a much deeper sense of awareness in throughout society, more than just you could do through campaigns, okay? The last part, I think, is to talk about the impact on society in general. So one is this, this greater awareness in society and not just greater numerical or quantity, but a deeper awareness, right? So it's like as if if you've studied history and then you watch a play about history or you watch a historical documentary, you're going to understand it much deeper. A footballer watching a football documentary sees it from a completely different perspective, right? And that's what you're trying to do, give everybody some kind of familiarity with culture. But it'll also help minority groups, right? So either those minority groups here could mean people who have culture, of a minority culture, but also all people who are more tied into their culture. So people who live in the rural areas. Perhaps this is a little bit of a generalization that people who live in the villages are more cultural than others. Older people, definitely more connected, because that's maybe, how they used to see their lives before. They didn't have television, so they only had to play the cultural instruments. Or groups which value their culture more tied in the culture, will get a bit of a boost, will allow to integrate to society better, and that's beneficial for society as a whole. That means good for you, good for me, good for everybody. Okay? So that's roughly your Gov case. Must sell the importance of culture, show how it's super duper valuable, and then show how, why we need to sustain it, because if we don't, it's going to go, we're going to lose it. It will disappear, I guarantee. And then talk about the students, talk about how this is part of school, developing them, why it's a far more involved integration with culture, and how they'll have loads and loads of benefits, right? Not just, it won't be something that they will all uniformly hate and be a waste of their time. It'll be something that will help them. But what then will we do on OP? Here we go. So on OP, I think it's important for you to have a position on the arts. I think, again, there can be a bit of a spectrum, right? So on one hand, on the most extreme low end of the arts spectrum, you can say, I don't care. I think it's a waste of time. It's useless. Arts never did anything for anyone. I think we should abolish it, which sounds a bit extreme. And on the other side, this is going to be closer to Gov. Okay, so you don't want to be heartless, because then people don't really want to live in that kind of world. You can argue that there isn't really much value from it, or value proportional to what you're trying to do here, right? I think that's the position you want to take, but it's hard for you to say, or it will be too cold to say, let's abolish art. Let's get rid of it. It's useless. Let it all die. Ha ha ha. Right? No, that doesn't really make that much sense. So take something in the middle a little bit, closer towards the it may die, and it is disappearing, but we're okay with that because we think that some people are still going to sustain it. And even if it's just sustained in a museum that we look back on, that's fine, because we think society should develop what society thinks is important for society. Okay? So something like that. That you think it would be nice for us to have some kind of, art and culture in society. But if we don't, then society's made that decision. Okay? And we think we'd be pretty happy with how society's made that decision. Society's evolved. Okay? I think you can talk about how government should intervene. You think government should preserve these things, maybe for collective wisdom. We can do some research. We can subsidize artists, right, to some extent, but not too much, because remember, you are also taking the evolution position. Okay, so let's get into the details. So on OP, you can talk about the students. Now you don't want, again, like I said, it's not really a debate about just education, but on OP you have a strong role to push on students, like it's against the rights of students, but more importantly, that students are less likely to like it. They will hate it. They will hate it now that you have forced it upon them, and they will, even if they like it, they will treat it in a very kind of, perfunctory, factory-like way. So now not only do I have to do these things on like holidays, I have to do this in school. It's taking away time from the things that I like to do, that are important for me. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. Okay. So you can talk about how not only is it against the rights of students and why students should be focusing on all these other different things, but talk about why you'll have the reverse effect, why it will be counterproductive, and why students are going to hate it. You are okay with inspiring students, right? So inspire them to enjoy the arts. Make arts cool. Traditional arts, cultural arts and performances cool. Get tie-ups with, artists, modern pop stars who are doing this stuff. Have, exhibitions and stuff, big optional things that students can participate in and they can choose to, or just even general adults. And if they like it, cool. If they don't like it, fine, right? So that's the kind of position that you can take. Secondly, also talk about the arts. And here's where you talk about the evolution, how it can change, right? Now, the evolution point about arts is not just arts here, right? But art here, I mean also culture. You talk about culture as a fluid thing, culture that is constantly changing. As we modify and we grow and we change, that culture alters. The culture doesn't disappear. It just becomes new. It becomes different. It becomes modernized and therefore more relevant. And because not all things in culture can be good, right? The position of women in culture has changed a lot for more positively than it is in the past. Culture can be a form of oppressing someone or asserting value. You don't think it's wrong or it's immoral if someone chooses to, be more into foreign culture or Western culture than their own culture. Like, why? I'm not harming anybody, right? I like it. It's just how it appeals to me. And it sends a bad message to people when you do this, because you're taking a kind of moral position on culture. You say this type of culture is right and that type of culture is wrong. Okay, so we think that's bad, that you're using culture to oppress people. And that culture, as it evolves, doesn't really lose that much value. In fact, it becomes stronger. And this is how the culture can become part of people, right? So because people love it, people like it, it becomes part of their lives, they become into it. That's how it becomes an important thing for all of them. Restricting this makes it artificial. So if you say that this culture is going to grow because the state is spending money in it, what happens when the state has no money? It'll die. What happens when, people lose interest? It doesn't matter, because the state's going to keep pushing people to do this. So people are doing it not because they like it, not because they enjoy it or value it. They're doing it because the state wants them to do it, right? And this is a problem. This is why, like, mandatory arts classes in schools don't create all these artists and sometimes make people hate art. Of course, the other side is you're not trying to create many artists, you're just trying to inspire their creativity. But when you're doing it with culture, there is a specific end game. You're not just asking them to be creative, because then you can give them Legos, you can do anything. But you want them to be creative and appreciate this culture. And to do that, you have to inspire. You have to invite. You have to persuade. You can't force. And if you force, you're going to get the opposite effect, right? They're going to hate it. They're going to push away from you, and then you will lose that, okay? And whatever positive things you get will be artificial and delicate. So the moment you lose funding, it could disappear, right? So that's the position, the biggest part of the case from the opposition. That culture evolves, culture changes, and you should let it change, and it's a good thing that it changes. Artificially controlling it is bad and insecure, and it's not sustainable. And it's bad for the students, it's against their rights, and students are going to hate it, okay? The other thing you can talk about is the alternative positions. Now, be careful here. You can't run some kind of subsidy. You can't run some kind of preservation. Because if you also preserve culture, then you don't have a principal difference with the other side. You just have a practical difference, right? So you're not really supporting evolution. And if you say we want to subsidize, we want to preserve, but we don't care, we are okay with it evolving and changing, that's a little bit problematic, right? Because there's a tension. If you're okay with it evolving, why are you preserving it like this, right? Now, I think you can walk a line a little bit, but you want to talk about, so I'm going to scratch that and then, well, better to kind of just get rid of it. You talk about preserving it like to remember, preserving it so that it exists in society. So like keeping it in a museum, ensuring that there are documentaries, right? And if as long as there is enough awareness in society, then society can make that choice. Because you believe in choice. But in order to have choice, there needs to be awareness. If there's no awareness, then I'm not making a choice because I don't really know it exists, right? So that is consistent with your let society choose position. The role of the government is to educate and to inform. And so the government will put up some public shows. The government can encourage artists to use cultural performances, host some cultural performances and so on and so forth. Put out some documentaries, write a couple of books, support some struggling artists, maybe because they need a little bit of support. I don't know. This can be a bit tricky. Maybe not support. I don't know. Subsidizing them. You think that's preserving? Maybe. It might be preserving them. So we'll just push the culture. You risk getting a little bit confused with your line. If you say we're going to pay struggling artists, then they will say you're also preserving, because if the society doesn't support them, then maybe they should die. Well, not die, but maybe they should die out, right? And if the state is supporting them, then the state isn't really, the artist isn't really being creative. The artist isn't really getting society to buy into his or her art, but they're using the state. So maybe not support artists, but encourage them to use the cultural performances, create more awareness with society. That's the position of the opposition team, and argue why this is better, right? Show how this is better because it is organic, right? It allows the change to happen, and it's better because it supports the evolution. It's tied into this. So if people like it, then they will continue and they will do it. If people don't like it, then they won't, right? So that's the kind of alternative position that you can take, that you can safely take on opposition, and also show that, maybe this is happening, that the cultural death thing is not such a huge issue on the government side, that, not everybody is just like disappearing and no one cares about it, that it is continuing in society because society values it. But of course, if society doesn't value it, you're also okay with that. Okay, so that's your opposition case. This is actually, thinking about it, is more of like your position that you take, and then you argue the harm. I'd probably start with this, to arts and culture, your position on it, and then how it impacts students and how it will be counterproductive and why students will hate it more and why you take a better position on long-term society, right? At the end of the day, my friends, as always, it comes down to your position and the kind of society that you want to live in. Is it a society that will preserve aspects of culture, even at the expense of removing some rights of some individuals, right? Because you believe that the state has a role to sustain and to grow it. That's how important you think culture is. Or is the society better where we recognize changes? New people get to define new things. And while it may be tough to lose some things, that's okay, as long as people had awareness and they make that conscious choice to lose those things. That's is how it will play out. So your first debate on culture, preservation versus evolution. Enjoy the debate and think about how, in real life, these debates are happening, because in one area where you can really adapt the debate to your real life, that theme, that area is culture. Have a cultural day, boys and girls.